Hi, I'm Anna Marquise, Civic Engagement Coordinator, and welcome to the People's Review Live, hosted by us, the Equality State Policy Center. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working to improve the lives of all Wyoming's people through transparent government, fair elections, and thriving communities. The People's Review Live is designed to help people across Wyoming engage with our government and keep up with important issues and debates. When we work together, we can ensure transparent government, fair elections, and thriving communities. And that's never been more important than it is right now. This event is made possible thanks to the generous support of our People's Review Live Leadership Circle members, Marcia Kunstel and Joe Albright, Mike Shanzi and Kathy Jenkins, and an anonymous donor. If you'd like to know how to become a Leadership Circle member, please send me an email, and I'll drop my email in the chat, or you can also find it on our website. I'd like to hand things over to Chris Merrill, ESPC's Executive Director, to talk a little bit more about our work, give a quick overview of housekeeping, and introduce today's panelists.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks to our panelists for joining us today. We're excited to get started. It looks like we have a good number of people who have tuned in, and so everybody is muted except for the folks you see as the panelists. And so if you would like to engage, you can put comments or questions in the chat, and we will try to get to as many as we can throughout the course of the conversation. And when you do chat, please choose the option to all attendees if you'd like everyone to see it. Otherwise, only the panelists will see it. Our topic for today is election integrity in Wyoming. And we are calling it the stubborn myth of voter fraud. And I'm excited to talk about the way we're framing that as the discussion unfolds. Joining us today is the Chief Executive Officer for the National Vote at Home Institute, Amber McReynolds. Welcome, Amber, and welcome back. Sean Morales-Doyle is the Deputy Director for Voting Rights and Elections in the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. Welcome, Sean.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Also joining us is Crook County Clerk Linda Fritz. Welcome, Clerk Fritz.
Thank you.
And President of the League of Women Voters of Wyoming, Susan Simpson. And Susan was also the longtime Albany County Public Librarian here where I live. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you.
So let's dive right in, shall we? So the topic we're here to discuss is an election integrity in Wyoming, the stubborn myth of voter fraud. Linda, Fritz, if it's okay, I'd like to start with you. And first of all, do you take issue with the way that I'm framing this issue this evening, talking about voter fraud as a myth? If so, I'd love to hear about that, or just would love to hear your thoughts on the veracity of claims about voter fraud. And second, I just would like to ask you some specific questions about this recent election we had. So what do you think about the way we're framing this discussion today?
I believe in the state of Wyoming, actually, I think that we conduct our elections very well. Is fraud possible? Yes, it would be possible, but generally the form that we would see it in would be if a felon goes and registers on the day of election and they swear a false oath on their registration form. We don't enter that voter registration into the YRH system for 15 to 30 days after the election. So we would not catch that they're a felon until after that ballot obviously is cast and intermingled with the other ballots. So the best way to handle that is prosecution. If you don't prosecute, there's no deterrence to a felon to not do it again. So in the state of Wyoming, actually, I'm not concerned about fraud.
So for folks who maybe don't understand the specifics of how elections work in Wyoming, would you mind just giving the brief kind of Reader's Digest overview of how it works, how election security is maintained and the integrity of the elections are maintained in Wyoming? And if you want to just speak from the experience in your own county, that would be helpful too.
That's a broad question, but I'll do my best. To try and explain, we test the voter equipment, the tabulators. We create test decks of ballots. They're clearly marked then as test deck. We vote them randomly. Okay, this is the first step. When we do that, we vote them randomly, then we go and we do a manual count of how those ballots were cast and put them onto an Excel spreadsheet. Then we go and we test them on the machines. And the machines, if the data that comes from the machines does not match what we have on the Excel spreadsheets, and we go back to the ballots, we check and see where the error is. And 100% every time the error has been human eye, not the machines. The machines have worked flawlessly, just as an example. Other ways that we provide security and integrity are, once we have our public test of the machines and they've been tested to show that they are reading the ballots correctly, then they're secured down with wire, like Ziplocs, so to speak, that have numbers on them. And we document all of that. We have witnesses that see that we have sealed up every portion of that machine that could possibly be tampered with. When everything goes out to the judges, all the ballots, they're all counted before they go out to the judges. The judges count them at the polling places and record that in their poll book. Those have to all balance out by the time it comes back at the end of the night. Plus those ballots go out to them under seal again, which is also on an affidavit. And it comes back to us, all those ballots come back to us sealed with an affidavit noting that seal number. We have judges that participate in different portions of the election. So the judges that are at the polls, the poll workers, are not the same people who help process absentees. And they're not the same people here that are here on election night who help us receive the data back from the polling places. We also have another set of election judges that are canvass board judges. So for fraud to be rampant, you would have to have major collusion from multiple parties, at least in the state of Wyoming. And I just don't think that there's that many people who are willing to do that. That's a small part of providing security.
May I add something to that? As an election judge for 23 years, we do everything in pairs and we're in different parties.
Correct.
So it's not a case of two people of the same party being able to cook the books in some ways. You've got someone of a different party, a friendly person, but still no collusion there.
I will say in Crook County, it's a little hard to get a representation from every party at every polling place. We are primarily a Republican county, so sometimes I'm not able to get a Democrat to serve at a polling place. I do my best. We actually literally go through the voter rolls and call people and try and get them to serve, but that's not always possible.
Thank you. I'd like to hear from Amber on this next question first, and then anyone else who would like to jump in after that would be great. So where this question is coming from is there's a lot of energy and time of late in Wyoming and elsewhere devoted to conversations about so-called fraud in the election. And we can talk more about that cultural phenomenon if you'd like to, but just taking a step back, Amber, I'd like to hear what you think when it comes to voting in elections. What should our main goals be? You know, like what should our best practices be to protect the integrity, but also make sure that everyone who's eligible to vote has as much of an opportunity as possible to vote?
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris. And thank you for having me. It's really an honor to be here again to talk about these really important issues. So I'm going to give you an acronym for this. And I talk about this a lot on the national level. We want faster elections. And the acronym, what that stands for is fair, accurate, secure, transparent, equitable, and reliable elections. All of those values matter equally, and election officials, like what I was in Denver, and like Linda, and the 7,000 plus that run elections around the country, have to balance all of those values that I just mentioned, all those faster, the acronym, all together. They don't have the luxury of saying security is the most important and we're going to forego accessibility to accommodate
security. They have to balance all of those values equally. And so the best election system does exactly that, where it's fair, it's accessible, it's secure, transparent, equitable, and reliable. All of those things matter equally. And oftentimes, and we're seeing this even today, a lot of the policymakers propose bills that don't actually balance all of those values. And so then we end up in a conversation of, well, it's going to hurt accessibility or it's going to hurt fairness to achieve one of these others. And so what we really have to encourage policymakers to do is to balance all of those values equally. And there's ways to achieve all those things in concert. Linda mentioned some of them, and Susan did as well. And a good example of a best practice is bipartisan teams working in the election process throughout it, providing access to the public so that you can see operations to count ballots. That's all very important as a measure of transparency. And then providing access to everyone to, if they want to vote at home, request a ballot to vote at home in states that don't mail them automatically, or show up at the polling place and have procedures to do that. So that's really, from my perspective, those are the important values in the conversation. And really it's critical that we balance all of those values together to make sure that we have a secure process that's free from fraud or free from nefarious actors trying to interfere with it. But then also making sure that voters have access and that voters don't struggle to get that access, which is the other side of that coin.
Great. Susan, do you want to add to that at all, or do you have, no? Yeah, that was a very eloquent and concise answer. So thank you, Amber. So Sean, the Brennan Center, I know that the Brennan Center tracks legislation related to voter rights throughout the country. And I was wondering if you could maybe take a step back and big picture, talk about some trends, some takeaways you are seeing maybe this year compared to previous years, or what you're tracking, what are you tracking, what are you seeing happening around the country?
Yeah, in some ways, what we're seeing happening around the country is very much like what we've seen in recent years, but on a different scale. So for a number of years now, really for the last decade, there's been a wave of restrictive legislation introduced in legislatures across the country. And that has grown substantially this year. And then on the other hand, in the last few years, we've seen sort of a countervailing trend in some states of expansive legislation that's making it democracy more accessible and making it easier for folks to vote. And that has also ramped up this year. I think that the rhetoric around our most recent election and the attention paid and the passion around it we're seeing that now manifest in legislation in state legislatures, but really depending on where you are in the country, that looks very different. I think we have seen a response to the big lie, the idea that the election was stolen, the myth of voter fraud, as you've put it, and so we've seen many states, many more than in the past, introduced restrictive legislation as a response to that, in response to baseless and frankly often racist allegations, and so we've seen well over 4 times the number of bills to restrict voting access introduced in state legislatures this year than we saw at the same time last year. And that is troubling. Many of them follow the same, they include many of the same policies. They include rolling back policies that helped make it easier for people to vote during a pandemic, mail voting, and voting from home, and other policies, as well as introducing new restrictions, photo ID and other things, which I know is an issue that's coming up in Wyoming. And I will say, I thought, I agree, the way Amber put that was fantastic. That acronym is a helpful way of thinking about all the values that have to be balanced. I think that the problem with the myth of voter fraud and the focus on the idea that the election was stolen and all of that is that it encourages people to only focus on a couple of those values and really harp on those things at the expense of others. And frankly, to focus on fixing problems that aren't there and fixing problems, focusing on values where we're actually doing a pretty good job. There are ways that our democracy could do better. There are ways where we fall down, but more often where our democracy is failing is in providing people an opportunity to cast a ballot, ensuring their ballots are going to count, and making it easier for them to do that, and then to be able to see it, see where their ballot is if they're mailing it, track it, be confident in that the system is working. Those are all ways that we could improve our elections, but this, rhetoric that there is somehow a rampant problem with fraud, I think, as Linda said earlier, there are ways that people can engage in bad conduct in elections, but most of them we've accounted for. Frankly, almost all of them we've accounted for, and people who do those things get caught. And it's really hard to get away with it, and it's really hard to pull it off, and it's impossible, frankly, to pull it off at a large scale. So we're already protecting against those things, and we're already hitting those values really hard, and we don't need to ramp it up more. And instead, we could be doing better on improving some of the values that sometimes get neglected in the name of security or something like that. And so we're really seeing a divergent trend depending on where you are in the country. In some state legislators, we're seeing a huge increase in restrictive bills, and in other legislatures, we're seeing them try to do better at providing faster elections, to use Amber's term. And it's concerning, like so many other things that we've seen recently, that the divide ends up feeling very partisan, and it is also very much based on where you are in the country, and people are just experiencing things very differently depending on where they are.
And I'll just pick up there. So here in Wyoming, we have, for example, right now there's a bill that's been introduced. It's House Bill 75. Its title is Voter Fraud Prevention. That's the title of the bill. And it'll actually be in committee in the House Corporations Committee. That committee meeting starts at 1:30 p.m. this coming Wednesday, and they will be discussing that bill during that meeting. And those of you who are watching, if you're interested in providing comments, I'll show you how you can do that on the website a little later, or you can also testify via Zoom during the meeting if you're available and willing and able to do that. So the premise of the bill is to prevent so-called voter fraud, and the way that the bill purports to do that is to require, among other things, but to require that people show photo ID when they go to the polls. So I would argue it's a flawed premise, but Linda, I'd like to kick this question over to you, because right now, if I'm in your county and I go to vote, first of all, can I vote anywhere I want? And second of all, what does that look like? Do I what do I need to provide when I show up at the polls today under current law?
Today, under current law, you would need to vote in your district and precinct. When you arrive at the polls, you would check in with the election worker or the poll book judge, and you would give your name, your physical address, and your party if it's a primary election, a partisan race, so that they make sure that you are registered correctly. As far as House Bill 75, the one positive note that I can make with that is that the legislators worked closely with the Clerks Association and actually visited with us about that bill. And so it morphed from two separate bills into one. In looking at it again the other day, I do think that probably the IDs that they are requesting at the polls should actually mimic what is requested when we register them to vote, rather than it just being a Wyoming driver's license or a Wyoming ID card. when you think about the fact that when someone comes to register to vote, they're actually being vetted, so to speak, by the county clerk in order to be registered. So at the polls, they're simply just proving who they are with a photo ID. So it should mimic the Secretary of State's rules on what we allow to register. And if I could speak quickly to the bill, I think it was in 2019. There was 2 words in that bill that the Clerks Association, or myself, I won't speak for the Clerks Association, had an issue with, and the 2 words were current and valid. So there were the issues with that bill was that if you were in a nursing home and you no longer had a valid or current driver's license or an ID card, you would be denied the right to vote. Statutory wise, we could not give you a ballot. So that is why that bill never made it, because it would have disenfranchised a certain sector of the population.
So I guess the concept here is that someone is going to go to the polls, or people are going to go to the polls pretending to be other people who are already registered. So they'll say that I'm so-and-so and I live at this address, but they're not really that person. They're pretending to be that person. Does that, now this is what this bill is supposedly going to stop, I guess, or prevent. Does that seem plausible to you? Does that seem like a concern that should be, elevated to the level of creating a new law to prevent it?
In my small county, no, but I mean, I can tell you that I have to train election judges that they actually have to make sure they ask that person's name and get their physical address. And I have had judges harassed before that the voter has said, you know who I am, I'm not going to tell you my name. But it's protocol. They need to do that. They need to provide their name and their address, mostly to make sure that our voter rolls are current and have accurate information. Is it possible in a larger city that, of course, you're not going to know, the election workers aren't going to know everybody in that polling place? I don't know that as it's written, that it would really be a burden. And I'm just being honest with you. I don't think that it would be a burden on the voter. I do think it's coming anyway. So if we can make it the best and the least invasive to the voter and to not disenfranchise anyone, that's our goal, is to work with the legislatures so that we don't disenfranchise anybody, and they're willing to listen at this point, which is good.
Great. Susan, did you want to jump in here?
Oh, I have a couple of things to say. One is that the Heritage Foundation, which is not a wild-eyed liberal organization, keeps an online database of election fraud cases in the United States. And according to an article published in April, there have been just over 1,200 cases of voter fraud of all forms, resulting in 1,100 criminal convictions over the past 20 years. Of those, 204 involved the fraudulent use of absentee ballots, and 143 resulted in criminal convictions. So you have 143 cases of fraud using mailed ballots over 20 years in the entire United States. Voter fraud is not an issue in our country, just flat out not. And even in Laramie, Linda, people come in and you know who they are, and they feel funny having to say their name and address and party affiliation, but they do it and it's fine. There's not cheating. It's not a rational fear. It's an irrational fear that they have heard again and again and again. And it feels true because they've heard it so frequently. And when you have a bad idea in your head, it's hard to get it out.
And can I add something too? So I think, and I looked at where Wyoming fared and just in terms of turnout, and Wyoming, I think, came in about 14 percentage points lower than the top states that had turnout. And Minnesota was 80% turnout. But I think the one sort of thing that I always like to bring up or sort of refocus the conversation to when voting fraud comes up is, while Susan's exactly right, it's exceedingly rare. The bigger problem we have in the United States is the lack non-voters and apathy. I think what people often forget is that about 80 million people did not participate in the most anticipated election of our time with the most money spent. 80 million people. And so when we think about those numbers, and then when we dive in and find out why, they feel like their government doesn't listen to them, they're disengaged, they're disaffected, they don't think that their vote matters. To me, those are the real challenges that we really need to be talking about, because those are the real numbers that are massive in scale. These other sort of things, to restrict voting because somebody thinks that somebody might do something when there's no financial gain to do so, and it's a crime that people just the motivation to commit a crime in the voting space is just not there. It just isn't, and that's why it's so rare. Is because people aren't going to put their livelihood at risk to commit a felony to do this thing. So I just like to sort of talk about those 80 million people that didn't participate for whatever reason, because to me, that is a much larger problem than the other.
Well, that tees up nicely another question I was going to ask you, Amber, which is, I would argue that with bills like HB 75, we're spending a lot of energy, effort, time focusing on the wrong things. And so if you'd ask me what are the right things, among those right things are, well, how do we help more people vote who are eligible to vote? Because like you said, the turnout could be and should be just way higher than it is. So, you were involved in an effort in Colorado to go to an all-male system of voting. And so I was hoping, first of all, that you can kind of explain what Colorado has done and, and how that works, first of all. And then I have a follow-up question on that.
Sure. So 8 years ago, we rewrote our laws in Colorado, and I will say that it wasn't just sort of a random, let's do this. It was actually driven by the voters. And for about a 10-year period, voters were more and more every year requesting a ballot to be mailed to them at home. And we also at the time had what's called a single sign-up process. So you could either sign up for the upcoming election to vote by mail, or you could say, send me a ballot for all future elections so that I don't have to fill out the paperwork every time. And we found that voters that are more, that don't move very much or like to vote by mail, they really liked that single sign-up option because they didn't have to worry about it. And what was great is it saved money for counties and localities because they didn't have to process the same requests over and over. So we got to a point in 2012 where 80% of our voters across the state were requesting their ballot to be mailed to them. And then about 10 to 15%, usually more on the 15% side, were voting early during the early voting period in person. And we were seeing 5%, maybe 10%, depending on the county, utilize the most expensive part of the election process, which was election day polling places, because of all the equipment, all of the locations. They also were having the most provisional ballots because people would go to the wrong place, or they moved, or they didn't show up at the right place. So we had this massive number of provisional ballots. So our costs were skyrocketing on polling places, even though 80% of our electorate were choosing a different method. So, and then kind of also with that 20% that weren't getting a ballot at home were calling us saying, why didn't you mail a ballot to us? Everyone I know got a ballot mailed. And it was because they forgot to sign up. So we sort of looked at all this data and then sat down, and there was a few of us involved, and it was bipartisan clerks and myself, a very small group, all women actually, which I sort of always say because Colorado, behind Wyoming, was the second state to pass women's suffrage, but it was all women. And we said, how do we figure out a better way to serve voters that's also more efficient? And so we crafted the idea of sending a ballot to all active registered voters in Colorado, combined with automating the process to update address records through the National Change of Address database, as well as through any other government systems that we could pull data from. And then also preserving in-person voting options. And this is really important. We didn't want to go down the Oregon route of just mailing a ballot and limiting those in-person options. We wanted to give people an opportunity. So we created vote centers, and that was also originated in Colorado. And those are available for 2 weeks. And then on election day, voter can go to any of those locations. We also created same-day registration and automatic registration as part of this, so that basically the government is the one churning the election process. So we're automatically updating records, we're automatically registering eligible voters to vote, and then we're delivering in-person services, and a voter can go to any, you're not constricted. So the results were pretty magnificent. We reduced provisional ballots by 98%, which saved a significant amount of money to counties. We reduced administrative costs by 40% in the first election cycle that we ran this in. And then we reduced our capital expenditure significantly, because we no longer have to buy all of this equipment to outfit all of these polling places. And instead, everything is more centralized because we're processing ballots that way. So Colorado jumped up significantly with turnout. We were also the first state to conduct risk limiting audits statewide. And so our voting system has been audited more than any other in the country. I think it's gone through 800 and some risk limiting audits now since its inception 5 years ago. And so we've become known as not only for the voting access side of things, but for security, because we've adopted all of these good principles that go along with it. And we were the second highest state for turnout, even though we're not a swing state. And we continue to perform in that way. And turnout has been maintained, and it's gone up significantly for primaries and local elections as well, because people don't have to remember to request or remember to show up in those local races. So our, school board and things like that have gone up to 40, 50, even 60% sometimes, depending on the county, which outpaces a lot of states in midterms and even presidential. So that's the model. Sorry for the long explanation, but that's essentially what we've done here.
Great, that's great. And you anticipated my follow-up questions and answered them already. So thank you for
Sure.
that. So, obviously we don't have that. And Linda, I'll let you chime in here momentarily. We don't have that here in Wyoming, but what we do have here in Wyoming is no excuse absentee voting, which is the way that I like to vote personally, because I can request an absentee ballot. It gets sent to me at home, then I could spend the time with it that I need to research the candidates I'm not familiar with and the ballot initiatives and all that. For me, it helps me to be a more informed voter, so that's why I like it. And so I'm going to ask you a question about that, Linda, but I think you wanted to first chime in on what was just said.
When I discussed House Bill 75, I could look at all of your faces, and you all kind of look like, oh my gosh, she supports it. My function as a county clerk, just so you're aware, is to make sure that every qualified elector has the opportunity to vote. And right now, legislation is coming our way that is supported by the state of Wyoming, or a good share of the state of Wyoming. And my function is simply to make sure that it is a good piece of legislation that doesn't disenfranchise anyone. So I just wanted to make that perspective clear. My duty is to make sure that everybody gets to vote who wants to vote. So the legislation has to be good to allow that.
Great. And so along those lines, there was a question in the chat earlier that I saw. So I guess I'll put it to you now. Some people don't have a photo ID. And so if you require a photo ID as the barrier that you have to provide when, to be able to vote, you will inevitably disenfranchise some folks. Can you speak to that question? In the chat, the question was, I think it was an example, someone in a nursing home, for example, who doesn't have a photo ID anymore. How, and I think I know where you want to make it line up with the way people can register without a photo ID, right? But I'd like to hear from you. How do you make sure that people who don't have photo IDs are not disenfranchised?
I believe what they're trying to build into the bill is a Medicare card which would, even though it's not a photo ID, it's a Medicare card, which would allow for those that are in nursing homes, because they generally should have a Medicare card. When they register to vote, if you have to go and look at the Secretary of State rules, I believe there's other options as well. So if those options mimicked what the Secretary of State's rules are to register, then they shouldn't be disenfranchised when they go to vote. And I don't think that that is touching on the absentee process, because that was also a concern, was that if they had to show a photo ID and send it back with an absentee ballot, the complications involved in that. So I don't think it's touching the absentee ballot law.
So along those lines, I mentioned the absentee ballot, and under current law, you can just request one and get one. You don't have to provide a so-called excuse. But there is a movement at the legislature now to get rid of no excuse absentee voting. So I just was hoping that maybe you could describe for people how that absentee ballot process works, and how you know that you're not getting a bunch of fake or fraudulent ballots, or you're not counting a bunch of fake or fraudulent ballots mailed into you at the county level there.
So for example, when we order our ballots, we have a count of what we order. When we get them, we count them and receipt them to make sure that we got what we ordered. When we send them out to the polling places, we keep a count of what we sent. We have a count within the Wyoming system on how many absentees went out and how many come back, how many we have left at the end of an election. So we do a complete ballot reconciliation at the end of an election. When a person requests an absentee ballot, we ask certain questions: name, physical address, date of birth, social security number, mailing address. So your neighbors they might know your address, but they're probably not going to know your social security number. Those are questions that we ask in order to issue the absentee. And it goes directly to that person. When they come back, you can't receive more than one absentee ballot back. So let's say somebody wanted to go and make a photocopy of a ballot. We couldn't receive two, not to mention the ballots themselves have to be on a specific paper with a specific ink if you've ever looked at your ballots, they have little black marks down the sides with numbers on them. Those are called timing marks, and those timing marks are specific to how they're programmed into the system. So they can't be replicated to turn in mass amounts of ballots that haven't been issued. Does that make sense?
Yes. And thank you for describing that. That's useful as we think this through, right? So one thing that just bothers me personally is implicit in a lot of this legislation is this impugning of the motives of some imaginary folks out there, imaginary voters out there who are voting with nefarious intent, when there really is no evidence whatsoever of that occurring. And there are, this is related in my mind, maybe not obvious when I say it out loud, but then there are other comments or points made in the chat here that, people don't feel like their votes matter. Back to Amber's point, turnout, especially in Wyoming, but turnout across the United States in general should be much higher than it is. So this question is for anybody. What is the cause of this? To me, it just seems like there's this kind of like underlying anti-voter sentiment. There's this idea that there are nefarious actors out there voting fraudulently. We have very little focus on on pro-voter policies in a place like Wyoming, at least I would say. And at the same time, we have people who aren't engaged and don't feel like their vote matters. So is that fair? Is that a fair statement that I just made, first of all? And second of all, what can be done about it, if there's any truth to that? Susan.
I think that being able to register to vote on election day is a wonderful thing. It makes lots of work for the clerk's office. I don't know how it is in Crook County, but in Albany County, at a single polling place, there can be a stack like that of new voter registrations. But for people to be able to go in and vote or change their affiliation on election day is terribly is empowering to people, because they find they're going to do it, they're going to participate, and they're not having rules about how you didn't register back in May stopping them from voting. And I think that the statutes need to be given credit for that capacity that they allow for people. It's wonderful. So it produces work.
Sean, looks like you want to chime in.
Yeah, well, first, just to follow up on Susan's point there, just a plug for automatic voter registration. If you have same-day registration, automatic voter registration complements it nicely, because you sort of have that constant stream of registrations coming in and smooth out the peaks and valleys, so you don't have all of that work on election day. But agreed, same-day registration is a fantastic policy that knocks down that last barrier for a lot of voters to show up. But to your question, Chris, I think the rhetoric of this issue, this rampant voter fraud that's going on, is really powerful rhetoric for a number of reasons. Part of why is because it does play on that lack of trust and faith that people have. People love a conspiracy, right? They love to hear that they like to believe that when things aren't going their way, that there's like some reason that's happening, and something for them to point to. And people have these sort of, ideas in their head. I mentioned before we went live here that I lived in Chicago for a long time. There are these, long-standing stories about, the way things were back in Chicago with vote early, vote often, or Tammany Hall in New York, where I live now. And so there's this sort of popular imagination that drives it too. So it's a really appealing rhetoric for a lot of reasons. It's also appealing because it appeals to people's anxieties and fears, and lets them sort of point the finger at a bad actor. And that's why I think we see politicians pick up on it and start pushing bills that are based on that myth. And it does motivate a certain segment of their constituents. And also, frankly, often deters a lot of voters. And so if you're getting elected, it deters new voters. And if you're getting elected with the voters that you have now, then you appeal to them. And instead, I agree, we should really be trying to bring new people into the fold, bring those voters in that aren't participating. And rather than trying to appeal to our worst instincts and give people that conspiracy that they want, we could be making people feel that their votes do count, and welcoming them to the conversation and encouraging them to participate. And that is, to go back to the original point about balancing all the different values, we're not focusing on the places where we really are falling down, and we're not pushing those values forward. But I do think it's because there is so much power in this rhetoric, and people have seen it, provide them political gains. And frankly, some politicians see it as a very convenient way to justify a loss, and blame it on someone other than the fact that they weren't appealing to voters. But certainly in a healthy democracy, we're trying to appeal to as many voters as possible and get as many people to participate, and then, letting the chips fall where they may. And so I think we have to find ways to have an equally powerful rhetoric that talks about those values, to counter this really negative rhetoric. And when I was summing up these trends that we're seeing in national legislation, I will say, for a long time, that powerful anti-fraud rhetoric was driving a whole lot of legislation in a lot of places around the country. We have now seen that countervailing trend. And there are a lot more voters for whom voting rights are a top issue for them now. This is a thing people care about. People, we have dozens of people showing up for a call like this to talk about this issue, and that happens all the time. And so we do have a moment here where there is a possibility to get people energized around the more positive approach to our democracy. And we are seeing that countervailing trend, and we are seeing many states passing expansive laws. And we're seeing, in DC, we're seeing the For the People Act being introduced in both houses of Congress to do that kind of thing too. So there is some hope that we're seeing a sort of countervailing rhetoric, but I think we really do need that conversation and that rhetoric in order to drive policy to counteract the negative message.
And let
Amber,
me.
it looks like you want to jump in.
I
here.
do. Yeah. So I think there's a couple of things. I think first off, the vast majority of the public does not understand election administration or processes. The vast majority of candidates have no clue, and the vast majority of legislators have never toured an elections office or actually gone to see the process in action. So that's basically the worst recipe for disaster. In fact, most people, even that work on voting rights issues or things like that, also perhaps have not been a poll worker, worked as an election administrator, what have you. So one of the big gaps, and honestly, the most successful pieces of legislation that have been passed in this country in the last 20 years, I'll just go back to the Florida era, the most successful legislation in states that work well, have increased turnout, have addressed security issues, have reduced costs, those things. Honestly, the Colorado package is up there. California followed what Colorado did. Utah also took a lot of lessons from Colorado and passed that in a very red state. They mail a ballot to everyone. But the other commonality in all three of those states is that election officials were at the table with legislators, with voting rights groups, with advocates on these issues. This vacuum that happens in a lot of states where voting rights organizations go and do one thing and legislators go and do another, and election officials get basically left on the sidelines, doesn't work at all. And it actually creates more disasters and more problems than it solves. And to be honest, yes, the HR 1 is actually another example of that. When it first came out 2 years ago, one of the first conversations I had with many of the folks that had worked on it, I said, have you talked to election officials or anyone who's ever run an election about this bill? And they said, no. Do we need to? And I said, yes, you do. And I am happy to, provide feedback. And so there were actually some technical issues that need to be worked through. There's still technical issues that need resolution. Now, I'm confident that stuff can be worked out, but there are technical issues that have to be worked through for it to be effective. And that is till I no longer am doing this work, I will continue to try to lift the voices of election officials in all of these policy conversations, because they're ultimately the ones that provide the service directly to voters, that are explaining the rules, that are training the rules, and often get stuck with pretty poor policies to administer, which doesn't help anybody. And then there's this concept, I think, along with that, it almost, when you've got poor policies that are not pro-voter, that don't balance out the values that I mentioned earlier, you also end up in a situation where the administration of it becomes so complicated that then you end up with the administrative deficiencies, and then you have people calling that voter fraud or voter suppression, even though none of those two things are true. It's just administrative problems because the policies are flawed. And I think the last point I would say is voter fraud and voter suppression are two very serious issues. And when we get in a place where we're basically saying anything that's this way is voter fraud and anything that this way is voter suppression, we miss the ability to call out the very things that are those two things, or deal with those two things in a very direct way. And the fact is, most things are not one or the other. They're in the middle somehow. And I think, and this is again my opinion, we lose our ability to have a real conversation about those two very important things, suppression and fraud, if we're just in this place of you want this or you think this or whatever, and it's one or the other. And I think that's what we need to move the conversation forward on, is calling out the true issues around voter suppression, calling out the true issues around voter fraud, but not calling every single thing one or the other just because that's the political hot topic of the day, one on one side, one on the other. So that's just my perspective. And I think that clerks and administrative voices are very important. Civic engagement and civic education is extremely important. And the more we can educate the public on what this process is and what it is not, the better we can defend the system from disinformation, misinformation, and all of this craziness that has transpired in this past election cycle and will frankly continue to transpire because we have an environment that's ripe for it to occur in because most people don't know how it really works.
So time check, we have 10 minutes left to have this discussion. I would like to go to a great question in the chat here from Michelle Escudero. This is for everybody. What in your mind is the lowest hanging fruit in Wyoming to, she says, address faster values, make elections more voter friendly? So open question to everybody on the panel. What are some great things we could do here in Wyoming that would make elections more voter friendly? Susan.
More vote centers. In Laramie, you have people who live in Centennial or live in the outlying area who have to come in to work, and they can't vote in Centennial when they're in work in Laramie. So things that make it easier for people to vote because they don't live what we think of as a typical American life. I'm talking about commuters, I'm talking about minors, I'm talking about people who don't have cars and have to walk places. There are all kinds of people who don't live a typically easy life, and we need to do things that make it easier for them to vote so they can feel invested in our communities.
Any others? More voting centers?
And there are a couple policies that are fairly common across the country that at least I don't believe are in effect in Wyoming. For instance, online voter registration, which is available really almost everywhere now, but not in Wyoming. I think on the mail voting process, the ability to provide to cure a ballot if there's something wrong with it, a notice and cure process. I think that a lot of the country, that is not something that only Wyoming needs to do better at. Lots of places need to do better at that. I think that became a lot more clear to folks.
Can you let people know what that means to cure a ballot?
Sure. So, if you mail in your ballot and say, like, one of the most common things would be that you forget to sign it, or the signature that's on file for you is a signature that you gave with your driver's license 10 years ago, and the one you sign with doesn't look right, and so it's deemed a mismatch when you mail your ballot in. That elections officials will give you notice of the fact that there was a defect in your ballot and an opportunity to cure it. So if it really was you who mailed your ballot in and it's just your signature has changed, or you forgot to sign it because you misunderstood what you were supposed to do, you'll be given an opportunity to come in and fix that problem. And I think as more people vote by mail, and as more people have started voting by mail for the first time in this past election, we saw a lot more of those problems, and it became an issue that states realized they weren't adequately dealing with. So that's a couple things that I think should generally be fairly non-controversial and could really help.
Yeah, I would, I agree with all the points made. And I think just on automatic registration, there's actually, it's interesting because a lot of times it just gets talked about for enfranchising voters and that kind of thing, but it actually is a security feature. And so when you actually remove some of the extra paperwork and the processing of paper, you're also reducing the risk of people transposing numbers and things like that within the data systems. And when you have automatic registration, you're also increasing the accuracy of the data. So you're getting more frequent updates from government systems, whether it be the National Change of Address database through the post office or motor vehicle or other, could be fishing, licensing bureaus, whatever government, like we give so much information to the government. Whenever we're filling out an address change, essentially think of it as more of a comprehensive solution that you could share data across, which actually can increase the security and integrity of the election while simultaneously producing a better voting experience for voters because they have to fill out less paperwork. In Colorado, it actually, and I had folks actually experience this, they literally never filled out a piece of paper to be registered to vote. And even when they moved to another county, their change of address that they did online through the Postal Service went with them and their ballot showed up. And they never filled out a piece of paper and turned that in. And so you imagine that, number one, their data was more secure. It never was on a piece of paper that could get whatever lost somewhere in an election office for whatever reason. But that all goes through, and the cost savings of that and the number and the amount of time that we remove from that process. So when you think about like Six Sigma and lean and that kind of thing, and I'm sorry, I have two small kids that are talking. But you think about the time wasted in all of this that we do. Automatic registration solves so many of those problems while increasing security and enhancing the customer's experience. So I think that's an obvious solution that actually achieves all those values that I mentioned in terms of the election process. And the other one that I would add is a thing called ballot tracking. So for mail ballots, there's systems now where you can track it just like a package. You get an email or a text even if you want to know the status of your mail ballot, when it's been mailed, when it's through the postal stream, when the election official receives it and accepts it. That again enhances security, but also provides better customer service. And it gives voters that visibility and that transparency of where their mail ballot is. So those are tangible ways that actually does address all of those values that I mentioned earlier. And again, I think the civics education, like we need to at a young age, start teaching children about what it means to vote, what those decisions on the ballot do, and how that relates to civics long term. Quick final story, and I'll be quiet. I have a 7 and 9-year-old. Every election, my ballot comes, and they say, "When are we going to start working on your ballot?" And it's always a long ballot, and we go through everything. And they say, "What does governor do? What does mayor do? What does the state rep do?" And I use that every single time to explain to them what they do, and they know what it means to vote. They know what those decisions mean. I explain to them, city council makes decisions about the playgrounds and what they'll be in the park. And they're like, "Really? Can we write a letter and tell them what we think?" And I'm like, "Yes, you can." So that I've started them at 7 and 9, and they get all of this. And that's what we've really got to do, is we've got to start kids, not in high school, young age, of how this happens and what these decisions mean so that they become lifelong voters.
So you mentioned that was fantastic information, by the way. You mentioned the national, was it change of address database? What's the official name of that?
So it's NCOA is the acronym, but it's administered through the United States Postal Service. And when you change, most people when they move, mail actually is what they first deal with, because they've got to get their mail forwarded, or they've got to put it on hold, or whatever it might be. And in a pandemic, that became even more important for folks when they're getting more deliveries at home. Deliveries have increased significantly, hence Amazon doing so well these days. And so mail actually is often the first thing that people think about. And there's an online way to do it or an in-person way. And when you fill out that form, that the post office, you basically can run your voter registration file against that national change of address database, and it'll return those addresses that have moved. And so in Colorado, we automatically consume that. We move voters to a new county or within the county. And if they move out of state, based on that data, we send them a letter and we say, "We see that you've moved out of state. Can you withdraw from Colorado and register in your new state?" So we're proactively telling voters that even move out of the state to register in their new state.
Now, is that something that all states have access to, or do you need to opt into it? Do you need to join somehow?
Yeah, there's two ways to get it. So there's a thing called ERIC, which is a multi-state sharing platform, and they can run the national change of address through the ERIC platform. And that's an opt-in that the state would need to do. So that means that Wyoming's data would be shared across all the other states involved. Colorado was a founding member of ERIC, so they've been on for many years. And then the other way is, absent ERIC, the state can run their own national change of address database by signing up through the program through the Postal Service.
And I'll just say, all of the different policies that we all just mentioned are policies that exist in, states that are run by Democrats and states that are run by Republicans. They've passed with bipartisan support. And in addition to all of the benefits that Amber did mention on automatic voter registration, and I'm almost embarrassed that I didn't make reference automatic voter registration, but it's also been proven, to the point we've all been talking about people not participating, it's been proven to dramatically increase voter registration in every state that's implemented it. So it's just going to bring more people. Every time you're interacting with the government, you're getting registered to vote unless you opt out. And so more people are getting registered, and you've got more people, getting their notices in the mail and everything else, then they're gonna start turning up and voting. None of those things need to be like a big partisan battle. They're all things that have been put into effect in states of all political persuasions.
That is going to be our great final word there, and we are out of time. So thank you, panelists, for joining us. This is not the end of the discussion. I'm sure we'll have many more discussions along these lines. So thank you once again for joining us, panelists. And Anna, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks for joining the People's Review Live. The Equality State Policy Center is a 501c3 nonpartisan nonprofit organization. We rely on charitable gifts to fund all of our work. Donations can be made on the web at equalitystate.org or by mailing a check to 419 South 5th Street, Laramie, Wyoming 82070. Again, you can email me if you'd like to join our Leadership Circle donors, which is Marcia Kunstill and Joe Albright, Mike Shanzi and Kathy Jenkins, Joanne Skyham True and Shane True, and an anonymous donor. Our thanks to them for making tonight possible. If you'd like to help sponsor the series, let us know. If you'd like to sign up for the newsletter, action alerts, or make a donation, just use the web address in the chat. And thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you at the next People's Review Live, where we'll be tackling more great topics.